So what I would like to share with you today are some studies we have done about what happens when people do things together. In a way, it's very much along the lines that goes on in the main room out here. Those of you who have been out there building knows that it's really about not just building stuff yourself, but together with other people figuring out how should we come about it, what solution should one come up with. And one of the things that we have been studying is what happens when people work together, when they coordinate with each other. And it seems that it's not just products that gets coordinated, also hands and bodies and languages gets coordinated in ways that might be interesting. And I will give you a few of those results. So starting from a very simple case of this, one of my colleagues studies firewalking rituals around the world. So this particular place is in a village in Spain where people get together every year on the longest day. They light a huge fire inside a stadium, and then at the end of the evening there is a thick layer of coal, and some brave people, they walk on these coals while they carry relatives on their shoulder. And we were interested in what goes on during something like that, when people share experiences. And to come up with a very simple measure of it, we basically put simple pulse measures on people who would be walking and on some of the spectators. And up on the image there in red, you see the track of a person who is going to do the fire walk. And at the first line, see if I have a pointer here, at this line here, the person has to walk on fire. And not surprisingly, before that, the pulse goes up. Now, underneath it in blue is his wife, Pulse. She's not going to do any firewalking, but you can see those two patterns are almost identical to each other. So in other words, when we share experiences, we actually don't need to do the same thing. There can be some kind of coupling of experiences that can also be seen in how bodies react. And this is just a way to look at it. In a firewalker, one can see the pattern of walking here in blue. We can see the same in a related spectator, but your ordinary tourist in town just doesn't seem to show any kind of structure in it. So in other words, doing things with each other also translates into traces in the bodies. Our bodies can in a way coordinate with each other, even if we don't do the same thing. Now some of the experiments we have looked like, as I said, looks really much as what goes on here. We have had situations where two people had together with each other to build cars together in Lego. And in order to get a handle on it, we put small devices on their hands so we could see, how would they coordinate with each other. And we introduced two situations. One situation where they could just build as they wanted to, and one where there was a boss and then someone who was an employee. And this is just ways of kind of showing how hands are coordinating with each other. When there is a pattern, it shows that there is coordination. Now, we started to ask a question, when people build cars, does it make a difference if they just do it egalitarian or with a boss? And looking just at the number of bricks, it turns out that when people just do it in an equal way, they build bigger cars than when they are hierarchical. When other people look at the beauty of them, they also tend to be more beautiful. So something about the way people interact with each other seems to translate in this very experiment into simple things. We also asked the question, what does it feel like? And when we asked about the subjective experience, it felt more fun to do it egalitarian than hierarchical, and it felt more like cooperation. But when we looked at the patterns of coordination, the patterns of hand movements, they coordinate less. So it actually seems as if when you are in equal relations, you don't really need to synchronize. It might be more fun, and it feels more like collaboration. There was only one area where there was a positive correlation between synchronization and some other measures. And that is when there was a boss. In that situation, basically, the experience of collaboration had a positive correlation with the hand synchrony. So synchrony, in a way, only feels like cooperation if a boss is involved. Otherwise, it seems to be much more about kind of diverting tasks out to each other. Now, one of our colleagues, he became interested in saying, well, maybe building something together, maybe this is not just about building objects in the world, maybe we also build relations. So he tried to add onto it, after people had built a car, they should do a public goods game, which is something economists like to do. And a public goods game is a very simple game. You get €100, 100 kroner, whatever, and you can invest it into a pool. That pool grows, and then the two people share it. Now, for me, in a way, it's the best not to invest in the pool, because if I keep all my money and the other person invests, I get half of his money plus my own plus a little bit. Whereas for the group, it's certainly a lot better if we invest everything. So, this is a classic case of how on earth do we convince people that we should somehow invest in taxation or public structures. This is just a really simple way of doing it. And in this situation, we thought maybe we could have people build stuff together and then see, would that change how they invested? Now, the outcome of it was actually really interesting, because the result was that in those situations where people both built cars and also played a common goods game with each other, the change was really in how their heart rhythms were coordinating with each other. So in other words, when they were not just building cars, but also building trust by investing into this game, and everybody after they had built almost invested everything in it, then suddenly the hearts, so to say, began to beat in synchrony, suggesting that when we do things together, it works on many different levels. Now, these kind of objects that we leave in the world, do they leave any traces in the brain? We had another experiment where we, very much along the lines that you saw out there is this pixelation board out there on the left. You get an idea, and then you have to say, can I make a small illustration of that idea? And we took some abstract concepts from the Danish Prime Minister's inauguration talk, things that no one knows what means, like egalitarianism and freedom and all these things here, and said to people, can you try to build a model of it? And then after they had built it, we invited them into the brain scanner, and they looked at these objects, and then they could either see how stable is it, or how good is it at expression of the meaning. It didn't make a difference to whether it was their own objects or other people's objects, or objects they had made themselves or in a group, whether they looked for stability. But when they asked, how good is this object fitting to the meaning, then it made a difference whether they had made the objects themselves or other people had made them. And this is the kind of magical tricks that brain scans can do. There can be said a lot about what it shows. This is kind of a slice through the brain. This is the medial, the central part of the brain here, something in the back, and something here over on the left side. The pattern itself is not interesting, but that pattern is also a typical pattern you see when people are engaging with other people. So in other words, it's almost as if seeing the object again that they have made with others created kind of a pattern that suggested other people and not just the object themselves. So it's almost as if that objects that you make, they come to contain neural traces of yourself and your collaborators. And this is something that we experience really clearly, just go out there and get the kind of experience of seeing your own little building inside of these wonderful houses that's coming up, or the kind of annoyance if it's no longer there. So in other words, building these things here is also about building identities and other stuff. Now, how many of you know what this thing is? Not many. I think it's actually Italian. But when you see it, it's really difficult to figure out what it is. And in particular, if you just see it kind of in pieces with an instruction for how to build it. It's in fact an apple peeler. You can put an apple onto this fork here, and as you turn the wheel, the peel comes off and the apple gets sliced off into some kind of a complicated thing. And we tried to do a very simple experiment where two different groups of people were given the same pieces, and they were given the instructions for how to build it. But one of the groups saw a small video that showed what they were building, an apple peeler, and the other group just had the instructions. It turned out that they were about equally fast in building the apple peeler, and there were about as many pieces left when they were done that didn't really fit in there. But what we were interested in was, would it make a difference for what they were doing, whether they knew what they did or not? And this is just a graph showing how much did people synchronize with each other in those circumstances. And basically those who knew that they were building an apple peeler, they synchronized much less than the others. So somehow you don't need to synchronize movements if you know what you're doing. When we asked them how much fun was it, in a similar way, it turned out that it's much more fun if you know what you're doing. Now that might seem kind of maybe not in itself so radical, but the next question we asked people about was, again, as we saw previously, we tried to do one of these games here, one of these common goods games, public goods games, in order to say, would it make a difference to their willingness to share with others, whether they had know what they were building previously, or whether they didn't know what they were doing? How did that translate, so to say, into their experience of what it would be like to interact with others? And this is a little bit of a complicated figure. It's a little bit of a complicated experiment. So imagine that you have been building this apple peeler together with another person. After that, we do a public goods game. You get 100 kroner or 100 euro. You can invest it into a pool, and then depending on how much the other person invests, it's multiplied, it grows a little bit, and then you divide it up afterwards. And if you trust the person that you're building with, you will invest everything because you will believe that the other person will invest everything and everyone will get something out of it. But if you don't trust the other person, you are not going to invest. And to make it a little bit more complicated, we had here two different situations. Namely that the person you could be playing this game with might be the person that you had immediately played with, someone you knew now for half an hour, or another person. And what the graph shows is this. So 100 is kind of the maximum you can invest. This means basically you go on in, everything goes into the pool. And to those people who knew what they were building, when they invested with someone they knew, in blue, well, they invested basically everything. And even in that situation where they were suddenly investing with someone that they didn't know, but they had already been in this kind of meaningful situation, they invested about 75 kroner or 75 euro. Whereas the other group here, who had also just been doing a building exercise, but a building exercise where they had no idea about what they were building other than following the instructions. Well, even though they were playing the game with someone that they had just built with, they only invested about 70 kroner. And when they played with someone that they didn't know already, they were down to 30-something kroner. So in very interesting ways, it seems like this really simple experience of knowing whether what you are doing, what is the larger picture that this is involved in, that translates into how are people going to interact both with someone that they know and also with someone that they don't know already. So in other words, knowing what you do might actually bring about sharing. So you can say the story that I have tried to convene to you is a number of experiments that are currently undergoing in our laboratory. We try in different ways to play with these instances where people do things with each other. And we try systematically to change some of the rules of the engagement. Do you know what you're doing? Is there a boss? And we try to see how can we look at this at different measures. Does it translate into how people trust each other? Does it translate into how bodies, hearts coordinate with each other? Does it translate into hand movements? What are the end products of it? And I mean, if these were final truths, we could say we should organize our labor market in these ways. We cannot know that. There are a lot of things that we haven't looked at. But at least in these examples that we have been studying, just based on what I've shown you here, there are some very tentative take-home messages. And when I say they're tentative, that's because, maybe things will show it differently. And the first one is actually a really important measure. And this is what is going on out here. Namely that our bodies, once we do things together, can coordinate with each other's, even if we don't do the same thing. It seems also that actually, if you have the choice between building in a hierarchical situation with a boss and an employee or just building equally, it seems as if people build bigger and more beautiful in equal relations. You don't need to synchronize to the same degree. This is almost kind of paradoxical because the division becomes easier. It's more fun and it feels more like collaboration. And in a way, the need for synchrony might only be there, might only feel like cooperation if a boss is involved. So it feels good to synchronize with your boss, but not necessarily with your friend. It also seems that if you build, and if the building element also involves trust, then the coordination is not just about hands, it also does something to bodies, to hearts. And that the objects that are a result of it, they contain in a way what we might call neural traces of yourself and your collaborators. It's almost as if you leave a bit of yourself out in the objects that are out there. It seems very critical to know what you're doing. You don't need to synchronize as much. We know this is a good thing. It's more fun if you know what you're doing. And knowing what you do might actually bring about sharing as well. Thank you.